Story 1. The Bermuda Triangle. Why was I so concerned about this as a kid? Story 2. I grew up during the peak of the Satanic Panic, so demons. Story 3. Stop, drop, and roll, and the attached emphasis lead me to believe my clothing would be on fire a lot more than it actually is. I also assumed that adults always carried around little ceramic tiles because people were always trying to pass fool's gold, also known as pyrite, as actual gold, and you had to be ready to do a streak test whenever that happened. Story 4. Bees still do not get along with wasps and hornets because they are aggressive and hostile creatures. Bees are interesting, however. Story 5. Randomly catching on fire and needing to stop, drop, and roll. Story 6. Spiders sometimes cause a bit of unease, but they are mostly friendly and do not want to be harmed. I try to take them outside now. Story 7. My older brother convinced me that A Nightmare on Elm Street was based on a real-world phenomenon where if you die in your sleep, you will actually die. Story 8. As a child and young adult, I was afraid of disappointing people. Now, I do not care and do things to make me happy or comfortable. For example, if I receive invitations to do something I know I will not enjoy, I politely decline and let it go. Story 9. Battery acid, like the kind that leaks out of AA batteries when they go bad. It stems from watching RoboCop when I was 5. At the end, a bad guy drives his car into a tank labeled acid. He comes out with his skin melting off, so I thought all acid was that corrosive. I thought simply touching it would cause the skin to melt off my fingers almost instantly. Story 10. Unsolved mysteries. Those old episodes scared me. Story 11. Well, quicksand, of course. Is not this the only real answer? Story 12. Tornadoes. This is amusing because where I live, there is a very low risk of tornadoes. It is not that we would never get one, but they are not as severe as in Tornado Alley or the southern United States. Story 13. Quicksand. I always thought there would be many more places with quicksand and many more sleazy guys offering me free drugs or trying to get me to become a Hare Krishna. Story 14. The Bermuda Triangle. I really thought it was a massive global problem and planes were crashing frequently. Story 15. The green light between escalator steps. I thought it was kryptonite. Story 16. My mom. When I was little, I believed she would hurt me one day. I grew up and realized she is mostly just a bully. Story 17. The trench scene in Peter Jackson's King Kong terrified me. Specifically, the massive grub that eats a manhole was pure nightmare fuel. I understand they are not a threat, but even seeing a lawn grub gets under my skin a little. Story 18. Electric heaters with their glowing red wires can be dangerous. Story 19. Anything involving hypodermic needles. I was terrified of getting shots, having blood drawn, or similar as a kid. Now I just get whatever vaccinations I need like I am going to the store. I literally go to a grocery store with a pharmacy to get them. I also donate blood as often as I can without depleting my iron levels. Story 20. My child is currently afraid of the toilet, specifically it getting clogged and overflowing. They literally will not flush any toilets because of it. I do not think my toilets have ever clogged or overflowed with my child around, so I have no clue where they got that idea from. Story 21. The dark. I used to think monsters lived in my closet. Now I know it is just my laundry. Story 22. Dinosaurs were big and scary with lots of teeth. I was a big fan of 1950s monster movies. Story 23. Anvils involve a non-zero number of injuries. However, I would argue that more than 99% of these injuries do not involve anvils being dropped on someone's head from an upper-story window or as part of an elaborate Rube Goldberg machine that an unwitting person accidentally triggered. Story 24. Quicksand. Why did cartoons make it seem like such a big problem? Or maybe I just watched too much Looney Tunes as a kid. Story 25. I did not use an elevator for about 3 years. When I was 7, my friends and I would always play hide and seek in our apartment building. One day, I was in the elevator, and it did not open. After about 2 minutes of panicking, my friend pressed the button on the other side, and it opened, but I was still terrified. After that, I avoided using elevators for the next 3 years. Even though I lived in an 8-story building, and often needed to walk 7 flights of stairs to visit my friend's apartment. I also remember the first time I used an elevator again, which was during a hide-and-seek game. I was the only one left and was cornered. The only option was to take the elevator, which I did. I escaped perfectly, like in a movie, and my friends were very confused. Since then, I have used elevators again. Story 26. Africanized honeybees. We heard they were in Texas and moving north quickly. We were all going to die an agonizing death. Story 27. The giant tarantula in a horror movie I saw when I was very young. Story 28. The thoughts of unidentified flying objects and alien encounters would make me stay up all night in fear. Even listening to the X-Files opening would make me cry. Now I am more like, please abduct me away from all my responsibilities. Story 29. My brother told me that if you caught a lightning bug in your hands and it lit up, you would get burned. Story 30. I watched an old episode of Unsolved Mysteries about spontaneous human combustion, and it absolutely terrified me. For the longest time, I was convinced that people were just randomly bursting into flames. Story 31. Public speaking. With age and some practice, I am getting over it. Story 32. Ambulance sirens. I was frightened by the noise and thought it meant criminals. Story 33. I was terrified of tsunamis after learning about them in school, and was convinced on vacation in Florida that there was a tsunami coming. Story 34. People trying to give me free drugs. Not once has a stranger tried that. Story 35. Spiders and insects. The majority are harmless, and it is most likely my fault if there is a bad encounter. Now, I love them and build shelter and ecosystems for them all over my land. Story 36. Flushing the toilet. I thought that tape lady from Superman 3 was going to attack me from behind every time I did it. Turns out she is not real. Story 37. Every Generation X member was warned about dying in quicksand. To this day, I have never seen it. Story 38. Automatic sliding doors. I used to think they would chop me in half if I got caught in them, so I bolted through them every time. Story 39. Fire. Not that it is not dangerous, but I was always very uncomfortable around it. I could not operate a lighter until I was about 20. Story 40. The monster who would kill me if I did not fly up the basement steps once I shut the lights off at night. Story 41. Possums. I hated them as a kid. I thought they were giant rats related to kangaroos. In my adulthood, I have read they are actually really good to have around. Story 42. Opening a can of soda. I didn't think my finger was strong enough to pull the tab up in one go, and if I didn't, my finger would be stuck. No idea where this thought came from. I was around 4 or 5 years old at the time. By 7, I could open a can of beer for my dad. I was so proud. Story 43. I had a weird fear of kudzu. When I was little, my granddad told me how invasive and uncontrollable it was. He also said that giant spiders and snakes lived in the brush. So I would imagine literal gigantic building-sized spiders crawling out and taking over the city. I genuinely thought that eventually the whole world would be covered in kudzu. Nowadays, I just think it looks pretty cool. We have complete areas that we just let be. Story 44. Rocking chairs. I thought for sure they would flip all the way backward, and I would tumble to my death. It turns out it is actually possible to tumble backward in them directly into a wall and really get hurt and possibly end up in the hospital. But not to my death. Story 45. When I was a child, I believed allergies and asthma were contagious. I do not know why I thought this. Anytime someone had an asthma attack or allergy attack near me, I became irrationally afraid. Now I realize they just need help. Story 46. Those massive inflatable Halloween decorations, especially the ones that would move, made me very sensitive to loud noises. I was also afraid that they would pop. Story 47. Ball lightning is a rare phenomenon, but I thought it happened with every storm. I grew up in Florida, so imagine my constant state of fear. Story 48. My basement. I grew up in an old 1800s house with a fieldstone foundation and hewn log beams. It was poorly lit and many creatures lived down there. It was a pretty fertile field of terror for a 5-year-old. Story 49. Thunderstorms definitely came from the fact my mom freaked out every time tornado watches or warnings popped up, and thunderstorms generally preceded them. We lived in a very rural area that was prone to tornadoes, and my house did not have a basement. Our neighbors did, so that is where we would go. Her freakouts were somewhat rooted in fact. These days, an afternoon nap during a storm with the windows open and a podcast is time well spent, in my opinion. Story 50. Asking for ketchup from the counter at a fast food restaurant. Most workers will not get upset with you for asking. Story 51. Everything that really scared me as a kid still scares me. Heights, when Bill Bixby turns into the Hulk, when that man in the movie Poltergeist rips off his face, the soundtrack from the movie The Omen. Story 52. Darkness outside the windows. Now, I realize it is not necessarily dangerous. I live in a pretty safe area. I still, despite recognizing it is not inherently unsafe, think I am awaiting a jump scare if I look out. Bonus points if I am at home without my partner. Story 53. My parents very earnestly cautioned me against random strangers offering drugs. Apparently, they thought dealers would try to get a 9-year-old with no income hooked on drugs. The same warning applied to Halloween treats with concealed razors. Story 54. The sound of cars was memorable. My father had a classic Beetle that produced an amazing sound, but at the time I was scared to death of it. Story 55. The garbage truck and workers picking up the trash from the alley behind our house. I used to hide on the porch. Terrified me. Story 56. Talking to adults as if they were a child. I guess I had issues with authority since before I could spell this post. Story 57. People judging me. I am still pretty scared of it, but I have at least realized that it is not very dangerous. Story 58. German Shepherds are known to be strong and large, but I have known many in my life that are incredibly intelligent and gentle compared to other breeds. Story 59. Santa Claus. I was petrified of anyone dressed as Santa. I still get a little anxiety when I see one. Story 60. The sump pump in the basement made a noise when running that creeped me out. Then there was the pit itself. I imagined it was much deeper and more dangerous than it really is. I thought that if I fell in, I would be a goner. Story 61. Cigarettes? I always tried not to smell them as a kid, but now I have embraced them and use both cigarettes and dipping tobacco. It is funny how kids can make a big deal out of anything. Story 62. The telephone. I was born long before mobile phones. I was petrified of answering and speaking on them. Story 63. Chicken Run. That movie, especially the pie machine scene, scared me a lot as a child. Story 64. I always thought catching on fire was going to be more common. I am glad I learned to stop, drop, and roll. They made it seem like everyone was spontaneously combusting. Story 65. I was terrified of doctors, hospitals, and any medical procedures. They needed 5 grown adults to hold 6-year-old me down to get a vaccine. But now I love it. I don't mind going to hospitals, seeing doctors, or getting vaccines. Story 66. The sign on the now demolished San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge that said, Oakland City Limit. Do not ask. Story 67. Cats. To be fair, they were much larger when I was smaller. Story 68. Quicksand. Any sand was suspect, and we had a summer lake house with sand all around. I was constantly on guard. Story 69. When I was a kid, I had a period of thinking Jif peanut butter was poison that would kill me instantly. Story 70. Spiders. I outgrew that fear by around 10, so I am not sure if it counts. But now, I cannot believe I was ever scared of them. Tarantulas are just 8-legged puppies. I mean, they are not, but I think they are cute now. Story 71. Ghosts. Now I realize that ghosts do not exist. Extraterrestrial beings are much scarier. Story 72. The toilet backing up and snaking the shower drain. The sound scared me so much. The clumps of hair at the end of the snake, accompanied by the smell, were unpleasant. Once I learned the mechanics of what was actually happening in both situations, all fear subsided. Now I actively search for gross videos like that. Story 73. Road sweepers, the large vehicles, are mostly seen on construction sites these days. I used to run away quickly as a child. Story 74. I used to be terrified of sleeping with the closet door open. I still really prefer to keep it closed, but I am too tired to care now. If I am already in bed and the closet door is open, and I cannot persuade one of the dogs to close it before I fall asleep, it stays open. Story 75. The Bermuda Triangle, quicksand, and killer bees. Here I am at 42, and I have yet to encounter any of them. I am really excelling. Story 76. When I was a kid, my parents had a fake severed hand that they would put out on Halloween. I was terrified of it. It sent me running and crying every time. I have no idea now why I was so scared of that rubber hand. Story 77. Spontaneous human combustion. I spent far too long fearing it. The night after I discovered the phenomenon, I was racked with anxiety. I felt every slight itch on my skin was the beginning of flames. My heart pounded so hard. I was also very scared after watching Jaws that I couldn't sleep and checked under my bed to make sure there wasn't a shark there. Yes, I know it doesn't make sense, but I was quite little. I went to a hot air balloon festival and was so overwhelmed by the sheer size of them that I ran away. The same fear emerged when school surprised us children by setting up a glider in the assembly hall. As an adult, I have worked on the 6th floor of a high-rise building and had fears and daydreams about a plane accidentally crashing into it. The image of the nose cone heading right towards me still bothers me. Rest in peace to all those souls who experienced that nightmare on September 11, 2001. Story 78. Spiders really just mind their own business and are not out trying to hunt and eat me. Story 79. Walking across wooden bridges. My older brother told me I could fall through the cracks. Story 80. Chupacabra Man. This stuff gave me nightmares for weeks, and just when I almost forgot, I watched some TV once, and they showed this monstrosity at 2 p.m., making me swirl once again in this creepy thought. Story 81. Quicksand has never been something I have had to worry about, and frankly, I am annoyed about all the time I spent worrying about it. Story 82. Lightning. Once I learned it could strike people with fatal consequences, I greatly overestimated the danger. Story 83. I would not say terrified, but cartoons definitely portrayed quicksand and animals escaping from the zoo as bigger dangers than they actually are. Story 84. I was very afraid of snails. I thought they would kill me with their slime. Story 85. Apparently catching on fire, stop, drop, and roll was emphasized strongly. Story 86. I thought the oil burner would explode and destroy the entire house at any moment. Story 87. My mother was terrified of dogs and deep water. Instead of making sure we got swimming lessons and exposure to dogs with good owners, she tried to instill those same fears in me and my siblings. Luckily, one of her cousins insisted on teaching us how to swim. We all loved the water. Although we were terrified of dogs for a little while, we grew out of that when we made friends with a family that had the best boxers. When I moved out, my mother actually ended up getting a tiny dog, but she never did learn to swim. Story 88. Little me used to think that the train would come off the tracks and run everybody over. I am not sure why I was so afraid of them. I am guessing it was because they were very loud. Story 89. My grandfather on my mother's side was a mean man, but he has been dead for a long time. Story 90. A strange one, woodworm. I got this from watching Star Trek II. The Wrath of Khan and the scene in which the worms bore into the crew members' faces. Story 91. E.T. the movie character. I had never seen the movie, only movie posters that showed his black silhouette outline against the moonlight, so I thought it was a horror movie. Story 92. Going on a 3-hour boat tour and becoming stranded on a deserted island. Story 93. Sharks in the deep end of the pool. I still think about it sometimes when I'm swimming. Story 94. Basements can be a little scary when you run up the stairs by yourself. Story 95. The intake for the pool filter. I thought it would pull me down from the surface and I would get stuck to it. I always had my cousin check to make sure the pool pump was off before I went near the deep end. Story 96. I was scared of exposed pipes as a child because when I was a toddler, I would get yelled at for trying to open the cabinet doors under the kitchen sink. Story 97. Cats. I was terrified of them when I was little, but as I have grown up and spent more time around cats because of my friends, I have realized that most of the time they will ignore you if they want to be left alone. I have dogs, but I have watched a couple of neighborhood cats several times. One of my friend's cats has grown to love me so much that I have become his second favorite person after her. The truth is that exposure to fear really is the best medicine. Story 98. Daddy Longlegs. I was told they were the most venomous insects on Earth and treated them accordingly. Story 99. The vacuum cleaner. Even just the sound of it would put me in a panic. I think I thought it was going to suck me up. Story 100. Bermuda Triangle, killer bees, and spontaneous human combustion. Story 101. The bathtub drain seemed poised to suck me down into the abyss. Story 102. The Birds movie. I am confident I could survive this. Story 103. Guns in general are not dangerous, similar to how no dogs are bad, only bad owners. It is the same with guns. A gun is not dangerous. An irresponsible, untrained, or careless person with a gun is dangerous. However, responsible, trained, and smart gun owners are 99.99% safe unless there is a critical failure, which most of the time is not the shooter's fault. Story 104. I used to be so scared of midnight. I would cry if I stayed up late enough. I thought werewolves would just appear and eat me and everyone if I was awake past midnight. Story 105. I feel like I was too worried about quicksand and female robots, but the verdict is still undecided on those. Story 106. For me, it was snakes. I grew up finding rattlesnakes on our property every summer. Turns out I was right. They are still terrifying and deadly. Story 107. The plug hole in the bath will suck me in if I do not get out when I am told to. Story 108. My old house's driveway was downhill and terrifying as a young bike rider age 8 and below. My husband and I bought a house in this same neighborhood, so I walk by it often now. It is not steep at all. Story 109. Growing up in the 1980s, I was deathly afraid of killer bees for about a year. That was when all the news stories first came out about them, so I thought they were everywhere, just lying in wait to sting me. Story 110. Being late at the airport is rare unless you really make a serious mistake and miss your flight. I used to be very worried about this. Story 111. I used to be afraid of the dark, but after playing Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, my thinking changed. The dark should be afraid of me. Story 112. Things living in the basement would grab my feet as I was running up the stairs. Story 113. I was terrified of backhoes. I thought they were mechanized dinosaurs. Story 114. I remember being scared of hoodies, long-sleeve shirts, and jackets that did not open in the front. I was afraid of getting stuck and suffocating. Story 115. Undercooked pork. My mom was absolutely sure trichinosis would be my downfall. She also made me think I didn't like pork chops because she cooked them until they were as hard as steel. Story 116. Quicksand. I was absolutely certain I would have to navigate that every day. Story 117. Yellowstone super erupting in the western half of North America and volcanoes in general. I thought a volcano erupting would be the worst way to die. Story 118. Volcanoes are dangerous, of course, but not as much when you live in the United Kingdom. Story 119. Snakes. I hated them until I did a wildlife rehabilitation internship and had to remove a little garter snake from a glue trap. I realized he was just a scared little guy, and now I love them. Story 120. Old televisions, when you turned them off, had a tiny green light that remained on the screen for a few minutes. When I was a kid, that light scared me so much that I cried when my dad tried to get me to touch it to show me that it was harmless. Story 121. Deer and contracting Lyme disease. I have only lived in cities. Story 122. Dinosaurs. Unless someone manages to bring them back, and some manage to escape, I will be terrified again. Story 123. Weed. I was raised in a very fundamentalist way and was absolutely terrified of drugs. To be fair, I still have a reasonable and appropriate fear of methamphetamine and heroin. I am not going to ruin my body or life for something so unwise. However, growing up and learning that weed was classified in our minds the same as those substances was simply insanity. No, weed is not like phencyclidine. I find that very amusing. Story 124. Spiders. When I was younger, I was terrified of them, even the medium or small ones. Now I am perfectly fine with the tiny ones in the house and can look at pictures of them without any anxiety. Story 125. Running out of gasoline while driving somewhere. I have never experienced it, but from my point of view in the back seat, I thought that was the worst thing that could possibly happen in a car. Story 126. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself and spiders. Well, yes, and spiders. That goes without saying. Story 127. Turning the cab light on while someone is driving is not illegal, but it can be distracting. Story 128. I thought cannibals were much more common and hiding in my closet. Story 129. Quicksand. From television and cartoons, I thought it was everywhere. Story 130. Catching the Black Death and dying. I realize now that it is quite rare and also treatable. Also mold on bread and other items. I would freak out and cry when I saw it. Story 131. Jumping off a diving board. I am still terrified and always will be unless Gregory Louganis teaches me. Story 132. Quicksand. All my favorite shows and cartoons made it a big issue. Story 133. I experienced night terrors and severe anxiety due to religious beliefs. Story 134. Aliens. I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s when alien abductions and related stories were popular. My late brother's fiancée sat me down and told me they are likely just exploring and studying us, just like we do with other life forms here on Earth. That calmed my fears immediately. Story 135. Spiders. As a child, I was really afraid of all spiders. But now, when my wife gets scared of a spider, I just take it with bare hands and carefully bring it outside. Story 136. Bigfoot. I grew up spending a lot of time hiking and hunting, so I was familiar with being out in the woods. Story 137. Getting eggs from the chicken coop. I had nightmares about the poop when I was younger, but now it is not that bad. Story 138. Marijuana was taught to be a direct line to Satan. Not exactly. Story 139. Helicopters. I was afraid of them when I was 5 or 6 years old. My parents thought it was funny because we lived on an Air Force base. Story 140. Earthworms are gardeners' friends, but I still found them unpleasant. Then I saw their faces under a microscope. I was not wrong. They are terrifying. Story 141. Sharks in the toilet. It turns out they are highly misunderstood creatures. Story 142. Outlets. I was always afraid that if you stuck your finger in, you would be instantly electrocuted and die. Story 143. Monkeys and clowns. I trained like a ninja to defeat evil monkeys and clowns. I am prepared. Story 144. Chucky the doll and toys in general are trying to kill me. Obviously, it is not going to be them. No, it will be the cats. Story 145. The submersible pump made a horrible noise and it was down a hole in the basement. To be honest, it is still a bit unsettling if it starts and I am not ready for it. Story 146. Spontaneous human combustion. From age 8, I thought that was probably how I would end up dying, just randomly catching fire and burning to death. Story 147. Spiders and the dark. I love the dark, and spiders are kind of cute. Story 148. Sand. Forget quicksand. I used to think all sand was quicksand, so I would always panic whenever I got near any amount of sand. Story 149. Flushing the toilet. As a child, I always worried it would overflow, especially in public restrooms or someone else's house. Story 150. Horses. I thought they all bit, kicked, and bucked. When I grew up, I started hanging around horse barns and reading about training them. Eventually, I learned to ride and train myself. Yes, I have been bitten, kicked, bucked, and reared up by horses. Understanding why they do it made me less afraid. Story 151. All kinds of supernatural phenomena, not dangerous because it is fictional. Story 152. The dark. Now I am only worried that I am going to ram my face into something. Story 153, Buffalo Bill. I mean, I still would not want to come across him, but being an adult in good shape, I would say it is safe to say that I could cause serious damage and create a scene so he would never be able to get me into the back of his van. Story 154, my permanent record. Not the legal kind, but the kind that teachers or others would threaten you with, saying that mistakes you make will follow you around on your permanent record. Story 155. I thought I would be dealing with quicksand and rabies more often. I also thought I would be fighting off many racially diverse gangs selling hard drugs on the corner much more than I have. Story 156. Vampires, of course. Who knows what might happen in a few centuries? Story 157. Someone or something grabbed me when I was drinking water directly from the bathroom faucet in the middle of the night. Now I realize, why would they wait for that exact moment that might not even happen? Also, I drink from a water bottle now. Story 158. Swallowing a watermelon seed causes a watermelon to grow in my stomach. Story 159. Ghosts are haunting my home. Honestly, I do not spend much time at home anymore. They might as well enjoy my apartment that I work so hard for. Story 160. Someone holding a knife, even someone I trust using it normally to cut food, used to make me nervous. Story 161. Car batteries and jumper cables. After seeing many movies where interrogation or torture is done using a car battery and jumper cables, I never wanted to help my parents jumpstart a car. Also, the scenes where people touch a car battery and are thrown backward, with their hair standing up, smoking, or burnt, that is just stupid. Story 162. Weed. They acted like you were going to hit a blunt and immediately pass out. Story 163. This will sound kind of weird, but my shadow and my reflection, I used to always be afraid of them to the point that I couldn't have a mirror in my room. Story 164. I think September 11th really changed my view of commercial flying. Commercial flying, especially in the United States, is one of the safest activities you can do. I was very scared to fly, and sometimes I still am. However, it is not a dangerous activity at all. Story 165. Getting lost. It took me getting lost and then finding my way again several times to realize that in most cases, being lost is just a minor inconvenience. Of course, I am not talking about being hopelessly turned around in a vast wilderness. That is dangerous. But like driving and not knowing where you are, that sort of lost. Story 166. I would have to say something like monsters under the bed and such. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.